The courtroom was eerily silent, the kind of hush that made every breath, every rustle of paper, feel deafening. Malia Carter, an 8-year-old foster child, stood in the center of the room, her small frame barely visible behind the heavy wooden table. In her trembling hands, she clutched a worn, creased photograph, holding onto it as if it were the only thing tethering her to this world. Across from her, her foster parents sat stiffly, avoiding her gaze. Their lawyer had just finished explaining why they could no longer care for her. She refuses to bond. She has night terrors. She's difficult. At the bench, Judge Naomi Carter flipped through Malia's thick case file. Something about this child made her uneasy, though she couldn't place why. Then Malia lifted her gaze, locking eyes with the judge. Her voice was small, but steady. "You're my mom." The courtroom gasped. Naomi's world tilted. Could this little girl truly be the daughter she lost 8 years ago?
Before we dive into today's story, we'd love your support. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more inspiring stories just for you. Now, without further ado, let's get started.
A heavy silence hung over the courtroom, stretching unbearably after Malia's words. Judge Naomi Carter sat frozen, her fingers gripping the edges of the case file as if anchoring herself to reality. The murmurs started slowly. Whispers rippling through the gallery, exchanged glances of disbelief. At the defense table, Patricia and Gerald Thompson, Malia's foster parents, shifted uncomfortably. Their lawyer, Elliot Gaines, cleared his throat, clearly eager to regain control of the situation. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, adjusting his tie. "As you can see, Malia has an active imagination. She struggles with attachment issues and has a habit of fabricating stories. This is just another example of—" "That's not a story," Malia interrupted. Her voice, though small, carried a conviction far too deep for a child her age. Naomi inhaled sharply. Her heart pounded, the words, "You're my mom," still ringing in her ears. She studied the girl in front of her. Dark brown curls framed a delicate face, her deep brown eyes filled with something painfully familiar. The resemblance was uncanny, but it was impossible. Naomi forced herself to push past emotion. She had presided over hundreds of foster cases, seen children act out in desperation for love, clinging to whatever hope they could grasp. This had to be another tragic case of misplaced longing. Still, she turned to the foster parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, please elaborate on your concerns regarding Malia." Patricia sat up straighter, glancing at her husband before speaking. "We've done everything we could for her, Your Honor." Her voice was polished, rehearsed. Naomi recognized the tone, the carefully curated frustration of someone more concerned about appearances than the child they had taken in. "She doesn't talk much," Patricia continued, "except at night, when she screams in her sleep. Sometimes we find her hiding in closets, clutching that photograph. And no matter how much we try to help, she refuses to bond with us." Naomi flicked her gaze to Malia's hands. The photograph. "Let me see it," she said, surprising even herself. Malia hesitated, then slowly uncurled her fingers, revealing the image. The photo was creased, old, faded at the edges, as if it had been handled 1,000 times. Naomi took it carefully, turning it toward the light. Her breath caught. It was a photo of her, younger, happier, heavily pregnant. Sitting in the garden outside the hospital, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. Naomi's stomach twisted. This wasn't possible. The gallery buzzed again as Naomi turned the photo over. There was something scrawled on the back, in childish handwriting. "You're real, Mom. Don't forget." Her pulse roared in her ears. She set the photo down and lifted her gaze back to Malia, whose wide, pleading eyes never left her face. "Where did you get this?" Naomi asked, her voice unsteady. "A lady gave it to me," Malia said quietly. "She worked at the hospital where I was born. She told me they took me away from you." Naomi's vision blurred for a moment as she gripped the edges of her desk. Memories flooded back, unbidden and sharp. 8 years ago. She had gone into labor early. There had been complications, chaos, panic. She remembered the cold hospital room, the sharp scent of antiseptic, and then the devastating news. "I'm so sorry, Judge Carter. Your baby didn't survive." She had been too weak to question it, too shattered to demand to see her child. They had rushed her into signing paperwork, urging her to focus on recovery. She had spent years grieving a child she never got to hold. And now, an 8-year-old girl stood before her, holding the only photograph of that time Naomi had ever taken. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned to the foster parents. "Where did she get this?" Gerald shrugged, crossing his arms. "We don't know." "She's had it since we got her," Patricia added, her voice tight. "Honestly, Judge Carter, she's obsessed with it. It's unhealthy." Naomi's jaw clenched. Unhealthy, or the only thing Malia had to hold on to. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain objective. She couldn't jump to conclusions, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Something about this didn't feel right. "Your Honor," Elliot Gaines pressed, sensing Naomi's hesitation. "With all due respect, we request an immediate transfer of custody. It's clear Malia is struggling with severe emotional distress. She would be better suited in a different placement." Malia flinched, her small hands curling into fists at her sides. Naomi's decision was instant. "No." Elliot blinked. "Excuse me?" "I will not approve a custody transfer at this time," Naomi stated, her voice firm. "Not until we fully investigate this matter." Patricia's carefully controlled demeanor cracked. "Your Honor, we are not the problem here. Malia refuses to—" "I said no," Naomi interrupted sharply. "This case is no longer about whether or not Malia is a difficult child. It's about where she comes from." She turned to Margaret Bennett, the social worker assigned to Malia's case. "Miss Bennett, I need a full background check on Malia's foster history and biological records. Immediately." Margaret nodded, eyes flashing with concern and understanding. "Additionally," Naomi continued, her voice steely, "I want an independent review of her hospital records. If there are any discrepancies, I want to know." Patricia's mouth opened, but no words came out. Elliot cleared his throat. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular." "So is an 8-year-old child having a photograph of her alleged dead mother," Naomi countered. "We are adjourned until further notice." She slammed the gavel down. As the courtroom emptied, Naomi sat frozen at her bench, staring at the photo in her hands. She had spent years believing she had lost her daughter, and now, with Malia's voice still echoing in her ears, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Malia lingered at the door, her small figure silhouetted against the hallway light. She hesitated, then turned back. "You feel it too, don't you?" she whispered. Naomi swallowed the lump in her throat. "Feel what?" Malia took a step closer, lowering her voice. "That we belong together." Judge Naomi Carter sat alone in her chambers, the world outside her door continuing as if nothing had happened. Lawyers bustled through the hallways, clerks shuffled papers, and yet her entire life had just been upended. On her desk lay the worn photograph, an image of her younger self, smiling with a hand resting on her pregnant belly. The same photo that had been clutched in Malia Carter's small hands. Naomi ran her fingers over the creased edges. Impossible. She had accepted the truth 8 years ago. Her baby had died at birth. She had grieved, rebuilt, and buried that pain deep beneath her work. Yet now, A little girl with familiar eyes and a voice full of conviction had just shattered everything. "You're my mom." Her fingers trembled as she picked up the phone. She needed answers. Naomi took a steadying breath before calling in Margaret Bennett, the social worker assigned to Malia's case. If anyone knew the truth about this child's past, it would be her. Margaret entered, closing the door behind her. She had been working in the foster system for over 15 years, her face lined with the exhaustion of someone who had seen too many broken homes and lost children. "You wanted to see me, Your Honor?" Naomi gestured for her to sit, then got straight to the point. "Tell me everything you know about Malia Carter." Margaret sighed and opened her thick case file. She's been in the system since infancy. No birth certificate on file, just records from her first foster placement. According to this, she was placed with a couple through New Horizon Family Services when she was just a few months old. Naomi's brow furrowed. New Horizon? A now-defunct foster agency, shut down 5 years ago due to financial fraud and missing records. But before that, they placed hundreds of children, most of them infants, into foster homes. Many of their adoption records were questionable. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. Questionable how? Some cases had incomplete medical records, missing parental information, or altered documentation. Margaret continued. We've tried to track down original birth records for children they handled, but most of them, like Malia, are dead ends. Naomi clenched her jaw. A foster agency with a history of lost records, a missing birth certificate. Something was very wrong. She turned to her computer, her fingers moving swiftly as she pulled up Malia's medical records from the state database. When the file loaded, Naomi stared at it in disbelief. Why is her hospital information so sparse? Margaret exhaled. That's the problem. The first record we have of her is when she was placed into foster care at 3 months old. Before that, nothing. No record of a birth, no record of a mother. It's like she appeared out of nowhere. Naomi's hands tightened into fists. The hospital where she had given birth was one of the facilities that worked with New Horizon Family Services. Could it really be possible that her child had been stolen? Naomi leaned back in her chair, willing her mind to focus, to remember. 8 years ago, she had been rushed to the hospital with complications during labor. She remembered blinding pain, a rush of voices, the cold sterility of the operating room. She had woken groggy, alone, disoriented. The doctor, a Dr. Leonard Foster, had entered with a sorrowful expression. "I'm so sorry, Judge Carter. The baby didn't make it." She had barely been conscious, still weak from the anesthesia. She had asked, begged, to see her baby. "It would be too painful," the nurse had whispered. "Let us handle everything. We've already taken care of the necessary paperwork." And in her grief-clouded state, she had accepted it. Now, 8 years later, she knew better. Something had been wrong that day, and she was going to find out what. Naomi couldn't ignore it anymore. Malia deserved answers, and so did she. She called for the child to be brought to her office. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Malia stepped inside, her shoulders hunched as if she expected to be scolded. Naomi softened. This child had been through too much. "Come, Malia," she said gently. "Sit with me." Malia hesitated, then climbed into the seat across from Naomi's desk, her small fingers twisting the hem of her shirt. Naomi studied her carefully. She had been so quiet in court, so withdrawn. But now, up close, Naomi saw something else. A flicker of recognition. "You said, 'I'm your mother,'" Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you believe that?" Malia hesitated, then slowly reached into her pocket, pulling out a second, even more tattered photograph. It was Naomi again, but this time, standing outside the hospital, visibly distraught. "The lady who gave me this told me you were looking for me," Malia whispered. Naomi's heart twisted. Who was she? She worked at the hospital. She said her name was Jenny. Naomi's pulse roared in her ears. Jennifer Lawson, a nurse from her past. Someone who had tried to speak to her all those years ago, but had been shut down by hospital staff. Naomi inhaled deeply. Malia, do you remember anything else? Malia nodded. She said the bad people lied to you. She said I had to keep this picture safe until I found you. Naomi swallowed against the lump in her throat. She reached across the desk, placing her hand over Malia's small one. Do you believe I'm your mother? Naomi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malia nodded. I know it. Naomi closed her eyes, letting the weight of those words sink in. She had spent years believing her child was dead. But what if she had been alive all along? Naomi opened her eyes, resolve hardening. She turned to Margaret. I want a full investigation into New Horizon Family Services. Margaret nodded. And Malia? Naomi turned back to the little girl who had shaken her world. She could see hope flickering in those deep brown eyes. Naomi wasn't ready to make promises, not until she had hard proof, but she could give Malia something real. She reached across the desk, gently taking Malia's hand. You're staying with me tonight? Malia's eyes widened. Really? Naomi nodded. Really. The child's shoulders sagged in relief. For the first time, Naomi saw a ghost of a smile cross Malia's face. And in that moment, Naomi knew. She wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. Even if it changed everything. Judge Naomi Carter sat on the edge of the guest room bed, watching as Malia Carter curled up under the covers. The child looked impossibly small beneath the blankets, her dark curls spilling over the pillow. It had been a long day, a life-changing day. As the silence stretched between them, Malia clutched her worn photograph, her small fingers gripping the edges like a lifeline. You're not going to change your mind, are you? Malia whispered. Naomi's heart clenched. No, she said softly. I promise. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. This child was not going back into the system until she had the truth. Malia gave a small, tired nod, her eyes fluttering shut. Within minutes, her breathing evened out. Naomi sat there for a long time, watching over her. Then she rose, closing the door gently behind her. There was work to do. In her study, Naomi dialed the number of the only person she trusted to investigate something this big, Marcus Lee, a private investigator with a reputation for digging up buried secrets. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Judge Carter? Marcus sounded half surprised. It's been a while. I need your help, Naomi said, skipping pleasantries. A case, one that could be bigger than we've ever imagined. Marcus sighed heavily. You always did find trouble. I think my daughter was stolen from me at birth, she said, cutting straight to the point. Silence. Then Marcus let out a slow, controlled breath. Tell me everything. She did. By the time she finished, Marcus was fully awake. This is serious, Naomi. If this agency, New Horizon, was involved in trafficking newborns, you're looking at something massive. That's why I need you, Naomi said. Dig into New Horizon. Find out who ran it, who funded it, and what they were really doing. You got it, Marcus said. And Naomi? Yes? If you're right about this, you're not the only mother they did this to. The next morning, Naomi met with Margaret Bennett, the social worker. I need everything you can find on Jenny Lawson, Naomi said. Margaret frowned. That name sounds familiar. Who is she? A nurse at Riverside Memorial Hospital. She worked there 8 years ago, the night Malia was born. Margaret typed quickly into her laptop, scanning through hospital records. A moment later, she let out a low whistle. Well, that's interesting. What is? Margaret turned the laptop around, showing Naomi the screen. Jenny Lawson was fired 6 years ago. The official reason was violations of hospital policy, but there are no details in the report. Naomi's pulse quickened. Does it say where she went? Margaret nodded. She moved out of state, Oregon. Naomi grabbed her phone immediately. I need to talk to her, she said. That afternoon, Marcus called back. I found something, he said, his voice tense. And it's worse than we thought. Naomi leaned forward at her desk. Tell me. New Horizon Family Services was a front, Marcus explained. They weren't just placing kids into foster care, they were selling them to high-paying clients under the cover of private adoptions. Naomi felt a chill crawl down her spine. And the hospital? They were in on it, Marcus said. Doctors, administrators. They fabricated stillbirth records to make it seem like these babies never existed. Naomi felt sick. Her child, stolen, sold. And who knew how many others had suffered the same fate? Who ran it? Naomi asked. The head of New Horizon was Dr. Thomas Wells. Name sound familiar? Her stomach dropped. Dr. Wells. The same doctor who had told her, coldly, efficiently, that her baby hadn't survived. Naomi gritted her teeth. Where is he now? He still practices at a private clinic, Marcus said. And get this, he's still working in adoption services. A wave of fury crashed over Naomi. She had spent years grieving a lie. Now, she would uncover every single truth they tried to bury. The next day, Naomi and Marcus flew to Oregon. It took 3 hours of searching, but they finally found Jennifer Lawson in a small town, working at a community clinic. She looked older, tired, as if the weight of unspoken secrets had worn her down. But the moment she saw Naomi, she froze. You found her, Jenny whispered. Naomi's breath caught. You knew, she said. You knew my daughter was alive. Jenny nodded slowly, her eyes filling with guilt. I tried to stop it, Jenny said. I fought them, but I was just a nurse. They told me to keep quiet. When I didn't, they made sure I lost my job. Naomi's fists clenched. They stole my baby, she whispered. They stole hundreds of babies, Jenny corrected. And they got away with it for years. Naomi stared at her, barely breathing. How do I prove it? She asked. Jenny pulled something out of her bag, a USB drive. I've been keeping records, she said, waiting for someone to come looking. Naomi took the drive with shaking hands. This was it. This was proof. Back at Naomi's office, Marcus worked to decrypt the files on the USB drive. I knew I'd find something, he muttered. But this is enough to bring them down. Naomi's eyes scanned the screen. There were names, bank records, emails between doctors, judges, and social workers, all involved in the illegal adoption ring. And then, a file with Malia's name on it. Naomi clicked on it, heart racing. There it was, Malia's real birth record. A hospital entry proving she had been born alive and healthy. And a forged death certificate signed by Dr. Wells. The final, irrefutable evidence that Malia had been stolen from her. Naomi pressed a hand to her mouth. She had spent 8 years mourning a lie. Now, justice was coming. Naomi took a steadying breath and turned to Marcus. Call the FBI, she said. Marcus grinned. I already did. A knock sounded at the door. Margaret stepped inside, looking stunned. We got the results, she said, handing Naomi a manila envelope. Naomi's hands shook as she opened it. A single sheet of paper. 1999% probability of maternity. It was official. Malia was her daughter. Tears blurred Naomi's vision. She had found her child. Now she would make sure the people who did this paid. Naomi Carter sat at her desk, staring at the DNA test results. 99.9% probability of maternity. The words were clear, undeniable, irreversible. Malia was her daughter. The child she had spent 8 years grieving was alive, breathing, and sleeping under her roof. Naomi felt her throat tighten. 8 years stolen. 8 birthdays missed. 8 Christmases spent in mourning. And now, the people who had taken her child would face justice. Naomi and Marcus sat across from Jenny Lawson in Naomi's study. The former nurse's hands trembled as she sipped her tea. "I knew this day would come," Jenny said softly. "I just didn't know if I'd live to see it." Naomi leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Jenny exhaled slowly. New Horizon Family Services was a front for a child trafficking ring, she said. They worked with hospitals to steal babies from vulnerable mothers. Sometimes they targeted teen mothers or women with no family support. Other times they fabricated stillbirth records to take babies from mothers who would never stop looking, like you. Naomi's fingers clenched into fists. "They falsified my baby's death certificate," she whispered. Jenny nodded. "Dr. Leonard Foster. He was the one who oversaw everything at Riverside Memorial. He lied to you." Naomi's chest tightened. She had trusted him. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Marcus asked. Jenny looked down. "I tried. I filed complaints, spoke to reporters, but every time, the hospital shut it down. Then one day, I was fired without warning, blacklisted. No hospital would hire me. I had to leave the state just to survive." Naomi's jaw tightened. "And the babies?" Jenny swallowed hard. "They were sold," she whispered. "Adoption fees disguised as private placement costs. Wealthy couples desperate for children paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. The records were altered to make it look like legitimate adoptions." Naomi's breath came short and fast. Her daughter. Sold like a product. "What about Malia's first placement?" Marcus asked. Jenny exhaled. "The family that bought her, they returned her." Naomi's stomach dropped. "What?" "They said she wasn't bonding. They gave her back, like she was a defective toy." Rage burned in Naomi's chest. Her child, discarded, abandoned. "What happened after that?" she demanded. Jenny looked away. New Horizon placed her into foster care, but by then the agency was collapsing under legal scrutiny. That's why her case files are incomplete. Naomi's mind reeled. Her child had been stolen, sold, then thrown back into the system like garbage, and the people responsible were still out there. Marcus set up his laptop and pulled up his findings. "I've traced financial records from New Horizon," he said. "They were laundering money through private hospitals, law firms, even judicial offices." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Judicial offices?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Several judges were fast-tracking adoption approvals, rubber-stamping paperwork without verifying birth records." Naomi's stomach turned. How many other mothers had been lied to? "How deep does this go?" she asked. Marcus's face was dark. "Nationwide." Jenny nodded. New Horizon was just one branch. There are others, other agencies, other hospitals, other judges involved. Naomi exhaled sharply. It wasn't just about Malia. This was a national conspiracy, and she was going to expose it all. The next day, Naomi and Marcus paid an unannounced visit to Dr. Thomas Wells at his private clinic. The doctor paled when he saw Naomi. Judge Carter, he said stiffly. What brings you here? Naomi didn't waste time. She threw a folder of evidence onto his desk. You stole my child. Dr. Wells's face barely twitched. I don't know what you're talking about. Naomi's anger flared. I have your signature on a forged death certificate. I have financial records linking you to New Horizon. I have testimonies from nurses who saw what you did. Dr. Wells remained calm, too calm. Then he sighed. I should have known this would come back to haunt me. Naomi stiffened. So you admit it? Dr. Wells leaned back in his chair. You can't touch me, Judge. You think you're the first person who's tried? The system is too big, too powerful. Naomi's fury burned cold. You're under investigation, she said, and you'd better start talking, or you'll take the fall for everyone. Dr. Wells's smug expression faltered. Marcus leaned in. You're looking at kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, human trafficking. You think your connections will save you? A bead of sweat appeared on Dr. Wells's forehead. Naomi pressed harder. If you cooperate, the FBI might consider a deal. Dr. Wells's eyes darted to the door. He was afraid. Good. Naomi gave him one last warning. The truth is coming out, she said, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Later that night, Marcus's phone rang. They're making arrests, he said. Naomi's breath caught. The FBI had raided Dr. Wells's office, seizing records, arresting hospital administrators, and shutting down 2 more adoption agencies tied to the operation. News headlines exploded. FBI uncovers baby trafficking ring. Doctors, judges, and social workers. Implicated mothers lied to about stillborn babies. Naomi stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The truth was finally coming to light. But it wasn't over yet. That night, Naomi sat on the couch as Malia curled up beside her, silent. She had seen the news. She knew bad people were involved. She clutched Naomi's sleeve. They won't take me away, will they? She whispered. Naomi pulled her close. Never. Malia's small hands trembled. They tried before, she said. Every time I got too happy, I got sent away. Naomi's heart cracked. No one will ever take you from me again, she promised. Malia pressed her face into Naomi's shoulder, and for the first time, Naomi felt her daughter truly believe her. The next morning, Naomi received a call from Agent Lisa Harrington, lead investigator on the case. We're getting more leads, Lisa said. Hospitals across 6 states were involved. Dozens of families have come forward. Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. What do you need from me? Lisa hesitated. We need a face for this case, Judge Carter. A mother who fought back. Someone who can give these victims hope. Naomi closed her eyes. She had spent years running from the past. Now she would face it head-on. She opened her laptop and started writing her statement to the press. The battle for justice was just beginning. Judge Naomi Carter stood in front of dozens of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones crowding toward her. Behind her, a line of mothers, women who had also been lied to, stood in silent solidarity. The world had learned the truth. Babies had been stolen, mothers had been deceived, families had been shattered, and Naomi was done being silent. My name is Naomi Carter, she began, her voice steady and strong. 8 years ago, I was told my daughter was stillborn. That was a lie. A gasp rippled through the audience. For years, powerful people profited from stealing newborns and selling them as commodities. Hospitals, adoption agencies, even members of our judicial system were involved. Naomi's gaze hardened. Today, we begin to hold them accountable. A thunder of questions erupted from the press. Naomi didn't flinch. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Naomi arrived at court, her face already plastered across the news. She had expected backlash, but she wasn't prepared for the threats. A white envelope sat on her desk. No return address. Inside was a single typed message. Walk away, or you'll regret it. Naomi's stomach turned cold. She had dealt with criminals, corrupt officials, and broken families. But this was different. This was personal. A second note arrived later that day. Drop the case, Judge. You can't win. Marcus Lee, her private investigator, wasn't surprised. They're scared, he said, scanning the messages. That means you're doing something right. Naomi wasn't so sure. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for Malia. That night, Naomi sat on the couch, holding Malia close. The little girl was quiet, unusually so. Finally, she whispered, "They hurt other kids like me, didn't they?" Naomi's heart ached. "Yes, sweetheart." Malia hesitated. "What happens to the bad people?" "They go to jail," Naomi promised. Malia stared at her hands, her small fingers twisting together. "Some of them already did bad things." Naomi's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Malia bit her lip, hesitating. Then, in a whisper so soft Naomi almost didn't hear, she said, "They locked me in the basement." Naomi felt her blood run cold. Malia's hands trembled. "They said I wasn't good enough," she murmured. "They said if I didn't stop talking about my real mom, I'd have to stay down there forever." Tears burned in Naomi's eyes. Her child had suffered, and Naomi hadn't been there to stop it. She held Malia tighter, whispering words of comfort, but inside, she burned with rage. No one was getting away with this. 2 days later, the FBI raided multiple hospitals, law firms, and adoption agencies connected to the trafficking ring. Doctors arrested for falsifying birth records. Adoption agency executives charged with conspiracy. Judges implicated in child trafficking scandal. Dr. Thomas Wells, the man who signed Naomi's fake death certificate, was officially indicted. "We have enough evidence to convict him," Agent Lisa Harrington confirmed. "But we need more testimonies." Naomi knew what she had to do. She picked up the phone and called Jenny Lawson. 1 week later, Jenny sat on the witness stand, her hands trembling as she faced a room filled with lawyers, reporters, and government officials. Naomi sat in the front row, Malia beside her, offering silent support. Jenny took a shaky breath. "I worked as a nurse at Riverside Memorial Hospital," she said, "and I witnessed babies being taken from their mothers under false pretenses." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. She continued, "We were told the mothers had agreed to private adoptions, but they hadn't. The babies were stolen, sold." The judge leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Jenny nodded firmly. "Yes." She pulled out a USB drive. "This contains financial records, altered birth certificates, and secret recordings of Dr. Wells admitting to the operation." The courtroom exploded with noise. Naomi gripped Malia's hand. This was the breakthrough they needed. 3 months later, the trial of Dr. Thomas Wells and the New Horizon executives reached its conclusion. Dr. Wells found guilty on all charges, sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Multiple judges, social workers, and attorneys arrested for involvement. Naomi stood outside the courthouse, holding Malia's hand as reporters swarmed around them. "Judge Carter, do you have any final words?" Naomi looked down at her daughter, then back at the cameras. "For years, I believed my daughter was dead," she said, her voice steady. "I know what it's like to grieve a lie, to wonder where your child is, to feel powerless." She took a deep breath. "But I also know justice is possible." Malia smiled up at her, and for the first time in years, Naomi truly believed it. That night, Naomi and Malia sat outside, watching the sunset. Malia sipped her hot chocolate. Mom? Naomi's heart warmed at the word. Yes, baby? Malia hesitated. There are still other kids out there, aren't there? Other kids like me? Naomi's throat tightened. Yes, she admitted. But we're helping them now. Malia nodded slowly. I want to help too, she whispered. Naomi's heart swelled with pride. You already are, she murmured, pulling her daughter close. Above them, the stars shone bright. Hope was returning, and justice was just beginning. Naomi Carter opened the front door, stepping aside to let Malia walk into her new home for the first time. The little girl hesitated at the threshold. She had lived in so many houses, been told so many times that this one would be her forever home, only to be sent away again. Now, she looked up at Naomi. Is this really my home? Naomi knelt in front of her, cupping Malia's small hands in hers. Yes, baby, this is home, forever. Malia's eyes glistened, and then, for the first time, she stepped inside without fear. At first, Malia still flinched at sudden noises. She double-checked locks before going to bed. She hoarded food, stuffing granola bars into her pillowcase, just in case. Naomi never scolded her for it. She simply reassured her, again and again. You're safe now. You don't have to be afraid. No one will take you away. One night, Naomi found Malia curled up in the hallway, blankets wrapped around her like a shield. I'm scared, she whispered. If I sleep in a bed, they might send me away. Naomi's heart broke. She picked Malia up and carried her to her room, tucking her under the covers. You're not going anywhere, Naomi whispered, lying beside her. I promise. Malia didn't respond, but for the first time, she slept through the night. The next few weeks were filled with firsts Naomi had missed. First time braiding Malia's hair in the morning. First bedtime story, read with warmth instead of obligation. First art project stuck to the fridge, a crayon drawing of them holding hands. Each moment stitched together the years they had lost, binding them as mother and daughter. And yet, there were hard moments too. The first time Naomi raised her voice, not at Malia, but at a broken appliance, the little girl flinched, shrinking back into herself. The first time Naomi left for work, Malia clung to her leg, begging her not to go. But with time, trust grew. Malia started running to greet Naomi when she came home, instead of fearing she wouldn't return. She started playing outside without glancing over her shoulder, instead of expecting someone to punish her for being too happy. And one night, as Naomi tucked her in, Malia whispered something new. I love you, Mommy. Naomi couldn't stop her tears. She kissed her daughter's forehead. I love you too, baby, more than anything. As Malia grew stronger, she started asking questions. Mom, do other kids have stories like mine? Are there other moms who lost their babies? Can we help them? Naomi had already been working with authorities to help reunite families. But now, she knew, Malia wanted to be part of it too. They attended support groups for reunited families. Malia shared her story with kids like her, giving them hope. She met other children who had been stolen, just like her, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. One afternoon, as they sorted through old records, Naomi noticed Malia holding the worn photograph she had clutched in the courtroom. It was the only thing she had left from her past. She traced the faded edges with her finger. Do you want to talk about it? Naomi asked gently. Malia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I was afraid to forget you. Naomi's chest ached. I thought, if I kept this, I'd always remember that you were real. Tears filled Naomi's eyes. I never forgot you either, baby. Malia looked up at her mother, and for the first time, she smiled without sadness. One evening, as Naomi washed dishes, she heard laughter from the living room. She peeked in to see Malia, twirling in a princess dress, giggling. A normal childhood moment, a moment that should have been stolen forever. Naomi leaned against the doorway, her heart swelling. This was their life now. A home, a family, a future. Malia noticed her watching and grinned. "Mom, come dance with me." Naomi laughed, setting the dish towel aside. And as she took her daughter's hands, twirling in the warm glow of their living room, she knew. They had both finally found their way home. Naomi Carter sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of case files, each one representing a stolen child. Malia played quietly in the corner, coloring in a notebook, a picture of a little girl holding hands with her mother. It had been months since their reunion, but Naomi knew their fight wasn't over. Her phone rang. It was Agent Lisa Harrington. "We have new evidence," Lisa said. "More families, more children. This goes deeper than we thought." Naomi closed her eyes, steadying herself. She had thought the nightmare was ending, but it was just beginning. Naomi Carter sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of case files, each one representing a stolen child. Malia played quietly in the corner, coloring in a notebook, a picture of a little girl holding hands with her mother. It had been months since their reunion, but Naomi knew their fight wasn't over. Her phone rang. It was Agent Lisa Harrington. "We have new evidence," Lisa said. "More families, more children. This goes deeper than we thought." Naomi closed her eyes, steadying herself. She had thought the nightmare was ending, but it was just beginning. Weeks later, Naomi and Malia sat in a room filled with reunited families. Women held the children they thought they'd lost forever. Children clung to mothers they barely remembered. Tears, laughter, a room full of miracles. Malia walked over to a little boy sitting alone. "Hi," she said softly. He looked up, hesitant. Malia smiled, holding out her drawing. "This is my mom. I found her." His eyes widened. "You did?" Malia nodded. "You will too." For the first time that day, he smiled. Naomi watched from across the room, her heart swelling with pride. Malia had been through so much, but she had turned her pain into purpose, and Naomi was so proud of her. Months later, Naomi sat in the largest courtroom she had ever entered. She wasn't the judge this time. She was the witness. The case against the remaining criminals was huge. She took a deep breath as the prosecutor stepped forward. "Judge Carter," he said, "can you state for the record why you're here today?" Naomi looked over at Dr. Wells, sitting cold and expressionless. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She turned to the jury. "I was told my daughter was dead," she said. "For 8 years, I grieved a lie." Gasps rippled through the room. "My child was stolen, and she was not the only one." Naomi's voice never wavered. She told them everything: the falsified records, the stolen children, the parents who paid to adopt babies that were never theirs. And when she finished, she turned to the defense table. "You tried to break my daughter," she said, her voice steady. "But she is stronger than you." And with that, justice began to take its final course. The courtroom had been replaced by a conference hall. Naomi stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of people, mothers, fathers, children, all of them part of a growing movement. She took a deep breath. "When my daughter stood up in that courtroom and said, 'You're my mom,' she changed my life," Naomi began. "But she also did something bigger. She exposed a system that was meant to stay hidden. She helped bring families back together." Applause filled the room. In the front row, Malia beamed. A reporter raised his hand. "What's next, Judge Carter?" Naomi smiled. "We fight," she said. "We find every stolen child, and we bring them home." That night, Naomi and Malia sat outside, looking up at the stars. "Are we done now?" Malia asked, sipping her hot chocolate. Naomi smiled softly. "No, baby," she said, "but we're getting closer." Malia leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "You're not going anywhere, right?" she whispered. Naomi wrapped an arm around her. "Never," she promised. Malia yawned. "Good," she mumbled, "because I really like it here." Naomi laughed gently, and for the first time in years she knew they were finally home, forever.